So when we begin our first lecture of the axial skeleton, our first structure we're going to talk about is the skull. Now the skull is composed of two types of bones. We have what's called facial cranium and neurocranium. So I'll write this here on the board. So there are two parts to the skull or cranium. The first part is our facial cranium. The second part is the neurocranium. Now when we look at these bones, we'll be able to tell, hopefully, pretty easy what is neurocranium or what is facial cranium. Facial cranium makes up our facial structure. Neurocranium are the bones that surround and house the brain itself. That's the neurocranium. Now some of these bones are going to overlap and be both facial cranium and neurocranium as well. So when we get into the slides and start looking at the bones, we'll talk about that. Okay? Everyone good with this idea? So we'll move forward. So when we look at the slides, each bone, for the most part, is going to have its own slide. When we look at this and read this, the frontal bone is the name of the bone. For instance, it is this golden bone up front here that makes up the forehead. There's going to be a number next to the bone in parentheses. This indicates how many of these bones is in the skull. Some are going to have a 1 next to them, like the frontal, meaning there's only one of those bones. And other bones are just going to have a 2 next to them, meaning they're bilateral on both sides. You're never going to see a cranial bone that is 3 or 4. It's either going to be 1 or 2. Does that make sense? So just a single or paired bilateral bones. So the frontal bone is just one single bone. Right here in the front makes up the forehead. Would you say that this is neurocranium or facial cranium? Would it make up part of the face? Right, your forehead, so it's facial cranium. But does your brain sit behind this frontal bone? So it's also neurocranium. So put in your notes, this is both facial and neurocranium. Facial and neurocranium. Okay. Now, in the slides, there's a lot of detail here that just kind of gives some explanation to what the bone does. When we get to the bone lab later this week and you get your hands on the skull models, you're going to see that, yes, it does make up the forehead. The bone then wraps underneath and makes the superior border of the orbital socket for the eye. It does create the bridge over the nasal cavity. And this frontal bone goes back a little ways too, tucked in into the neurocranium. Now, a couple things that I want you to know is this supraorbital foramen. If you want to put a star next to that, this supraorbital foramen has been tagged over here on the right side, and it's also over here on the left side. We talked a little bit about a foramen in bone tissue with the nutrient or foramen or Volkmann's canals. But what a foramen does is a foramen is a hole in bone for the passage of a vein. And that is for a vein, artery, and a nerve. Because remember, wherever we find a vein, we're probably going to find an artery next to it, and a nerve as well. Okay? Or you could say wherever you find an artery, there's going to be a vein and a nerve, or wherever you find a nerve, there's probably going to be a vein and an artery. So this opening here is called the supraorbital foramen. You have the supraorbital nerve, artery, and vein that come out through that, and they cover over the forehead. That's not as important as the bony structure at this point. Now, there's also this structure on here called the frontal sinuses. We will talk about the sinuses all together because there are multiple areas of sinuses throughout the cranium. But the frontal sinuses we're usually going to see are a couple paired sinuses in this area on both sides, but we'll talk more about sinuses all together later on. Okay? So frontal bone, facial cranium, neurocranium, makes up the forehead, and then the supraorbital foramen above the eye socket. Okay? Look it up. Next on our list as we move along, we have what's called the parietal bones. The parietal bones, there are two of them. They're paired bilateral on the top part of the cranium, on the left and on the right. So neurocranium or facial cranium? Neurocranium, very good. So this is definitely a neurocranium. They give a roof of the cranium, the side walls, all that stuff. Now, when we come to the parietal bones, we get to these things called sutures. Sutures are cranial joints. I'm going to write this down. Sutures. So these are joints or articulations of the cranial bones. Okay. Now, there are many different sutures throughout the skull, but we are going to focus on four major sutures. These four major sutures actually surround the parietal bones. The first suture we're going to look at is called the sagittal suture. The sagittal suture is right down the midline, just like the sagittal plane in chapter 1. It's right down the midline between the left and right parietal bones. So we'll say in midline between left and right parietal bones. Unfortunately, we don't really have a good diagram in our notes to show the sagittal suture, but we'll definitely be able to see it in our lab. The next suture that we want to talk about that's also on the slide is the coronal suture. You could also call this the frontal suture, just like the frontal or coronal plane. Okay. Now, this is where the coronal or frontal suture is. It actually is between the parietal bones and the frontal bone, and it arches all the way over and goes across the top of the skull to the other side. So we'll put in here between left and right, parietal bones and frontal bone. Okay. All right. Now, the next suture, it's not on your slide here, but we're going to go ahead and talk about it. It is this squamous suture. This squamous suture is between the temporal bone and the parietal bone on both sides. So we're going to say located between parietal and temporal bones, bilateral. Okay, so on both sides of the skull. All right, then the last suture we're going to do is actually around the parietal bone, and it's in the back. So it actually is between the occipital bone, which is in purple, and the parietal bone, as well as the occipital bone and the temporal bone. And then it arches over across the midline and to the other side. And this is called the lambdoidal or lambdoid suture. Okay. So this is between occipital and parietal, as well as between occipital and temporal. Okay. And this is a single continuous suture that goes over like an arch, like the frontal and coronal, but in the back. So those are our four major sutures. So far we've done the frontal bone, and then the two parietal bones that are bilateral on the top of the cranium. We'll move on to our next cranial bone. This one's called the occipital bone. This occipital bone only has one in the cranium, or the skull. It is on the underside of the skull and wraps around to the back. If we look at our last slide, go back for a second. Here's where the occipital bone begins. It's in the back, covering the brain, and then it goes underneath and curves underneath and gives us the base of the skull. So would we consider this neuro or facial cranium? Neuro. Very good. So this is neurocranium. I'll get to our occipital bone here. So this is neurocranium. So not only does the occipital bone make up part of the base of the skull, but it makes up part of the back or posterior of the skull. Two major structures that we want to talk about in the occipital bone would be the foramen magnum. Foramen is the hole in the bone. Magnum meaning it's a large, so it's a large opening in the bone, which we see right here. You'll have to know that structure. That is for the passage of the spinal cord, where the brainstem attaches to the spinal cord and it extends down throughout the spinal column. Now, bilateral on both sides of the foramen magnum, we have these two structures called occipital condyles. A condyle is a new term for us, isn't it? So these are condyles right here, the occipital condyles. Their job is to articulate with the first cervical vertebrae, or C1, to help what forms the two articulations that holds our skull onto our spine. So let's talk about a condyle for a moment. So a condyle is a convex, smooth process for articulation. Okay? So these condyles are convex, and so then they would sit into a concavity, and it would allow for an articulation to take place. And that's what happens to attach our skull to our vertebrae. So we have frontal, parietal, now occipital bone. Now we're going to move on to the temporal bone. The temporal bone, there's two of them. This is this pinkish red bone right here on the side of the skull. Now the temporal bone has a lot involved with it. There's a lot of structures here. We've already talked about its part in the squamous suture between the parietal bone. We've already talked about the lambdoid suture between the temporal bone and the occipital bone. And then we can see here it makes up the side of the cranium. It even kind of wraps underneath as well. If we go back to the previous slide, we can see this reddish pink bone coming underneath and making part of the base of the skull as well. So what do you think? Neurocranium or facial cranium? Neurocranium. Yeah, very good. This is neurocranium. Excellent. So, our first structure we want to talk about, I'm going to go ahead and erase. You folks okay with the sutures? You good? Okay. So let's get rid of some of this out of our way. We need to get through our list of structures in the temporal bone. So the first one we want to talk about is the external acoustic meatus, or you could even call this the external auditory meatus, the EAM. That's right here on the side of the skull. This is the opening for the ear. Okay? The acoustic or auditory meatus. That's in the temporal bone. Now, just in front of the external acoustic meatus, we have this structure called the mandibular fossa. It's a concavity that allows for the articulation of the mandible or the lower jaw. If we go back here real quick in your notes, now I know we're back on the occipital bone slide, but I want to talk about the temporal bone for just a second. This structure right here, this is the mandibular fossa. It's tagged on this side, but I want to put blue circles there. A fossa is a new structure for us. A fossa is a smooth, concaved surface for articulation, or it houses organs. Now in this case, the mandibular fossa is for articulation. It does not house any organs here. We'll see other things when we get into the appendicular skeleton, where we have what's called the iliac fossa, and there's going to be internal organs like our intestines that sit in that fossa. But for the most part, I want you to think of a fossa being smooth, concave for articulation, and it's going to articulate with a condyle, which is convex and smooth. So you have the concavity, which is the cup, and the convex, which is the rounded on the condyle, and they can sit together, and then there's an articulation that can take place there. Okay. So we've tagged those mandibular fossas. Now they're called the mandibular fossa because the mandible or lower jawbone connects and articulates there. And the part of the mandible that articulates in the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone is called the mandibular condyle. So it articulates in there and creates that hinge joint for us. Okay. So next structure would be our mastoid process. The mastoid process is located behind the ear. So behind our external acoustic meatus, here's our mastoid process right down here. You can feel that on your skull. If you feel behind your ear, there's a part of your skull where it's got this knob that hangs down. Later, we're going to come back and talk about the mastoid process when we talk about sinuses. Okay? The mastoid process has a hollow sinus, or the mastoid sinus, inside of it. So, two more processes to talk about. The next one is called the styloid process. Think of this like a stylus for a computer. So this is the styloid process right here, a round pointed object that hangs down right here on both sides of the temporal bone. If we go back to our last slide and look at the underside, right here we have the styloid process on both sides. So it's a round pointed process. Its job is it has a ligament that comes off both sides and goes underneath our mandible into our anterior throat, and it holds the two sides of a little horseshoe bone called the hyoid bone right underneath our mandible. And there's a ligament that runs between the styloid process and the hyoid bone called the stylohyoid ligament. So we'll talk about this. Okay. So the stylohyoid ligament runs from the styloid processes to the hyoid bone in the anterior neck, just below the mandible. Okay? And it helps hold that hyoid bone in place. That hyoid bone is going to act as a fulcrum for the thin strap muscles of our throat to attach there to help with swallowing, and talking, and all kinds of different things. And that's what our styloid process is for. All right, so last thing I want to talk about is the zygomatic process. This gets us to kind of a lengthy discussion about the zygomatic arch. So right here, this is the zygomatic process right here, this pink arm that extends forward, and it connects with this kind of wing shaped on the green bone called the zygomatic bone. What I want you to do on your notes is make note this is the zygomatic arch. This is an archway where the coronoid process of the mandible can go up into, and there's a muscle on the side of the skull called the temporal muscle that goes behind it and helps pull and close that mandible, helps elevate it. So this is the zygomatic arch.